He took classified documents out and didn't just take out classified documents, but stuck them in the dirt under a construction trailer.
Hillary wrote, quote, "Given the politics now with bipartisan support including Schumer, I'll support repeal with sense of the Senate that revenues would have to be found. I'd be open to a range of options to do that, but we have to be careful that the R version passes, which begins the unraveling of the ACA." I'm going to repeat it, which begins the unraveling of the Affordable Care Act.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years.
Good day, y'all. This is my first video. I have some concerns about the trajectory of our second American Revolution. If you have not seen my articles, please check out my articles at medium.com/@Volshebny. Volshebny. That's Russian for magic. Please check them out. I implore you. My first concern is why it takes so much time to red pill everyone. See, when I was growing up, we all heard the line that journalism was naturally liberal or progressive, because those are the people that you want as your journalist, the skeptics, the people who question everything. If you want change, you want to embrace change. The opposite of that is called traditionalists or conservatives. Conservatives are people who defend tradition, defend the status quo. However, over time we saw things change. We saw Fox News come onto the scene and actually gave us an alternative narrative. Forget what journalism schools taught, that journalism needs to push progressive narrative to enlighten the masses. Rupert Murdoch was an advocate of the new news media business model in the UK. Instead of adhering to or defending a perceived truth, their loyalties were to partisan spin. If you've seen the documentary Outfoxed, which had the subtitle Rupert Murdoch's War on Journalism, this documentary was released in 2004 and focused on the differences in perception of the Iraq War. People who got their news primarily from Fox News had a drastic difference of opinion than those who got their news primarily from the National Public Radio, or NPR. The documentary's argument was that Fox was the propaganda arm of the White House, with a direct feed coming from the White House. They had former reporters from Fox go into detail about internal memos which promoted or forbade certain topics or questions. They posed a set of questions to people around the country and discovered that the difference of opinion regarding the answers could be linked to the preferred source of news, where they got their information. One question asked was, did the U.S. military find weapons of mass destruction, or WMDs, in Iraq during its 2003 invasion? 67% of Americans who primarily got their news from Fox News said yes, we did find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. However, only 16% of Americans who primarily got their news from NPR said yes. Why such a difference of opinion? I won't go into any further detail regarding Outfoxed. However, the reason I mention it is because here's my problem. Americans have already been conditioned. We're now accustomed to hearing liberal media versus conservative media. The traditional American networks are liberal and Fox is conservative. If you've ever wondered what it is taking so long to red pill people, this is part of the problem. You won't be able to just give articles from alternative media and expect to convince someone that you're right and they're wrong. Americans have been conditioned to discount you and me because our sources are questionable. Is it spin? If you want to convince your friends and family or your fellow Americans that you are right and they're wrong, or that you at least deserve a moment of their time to be heard, we need to convince them through actions. Actions speak louder than words. How can we tell if we're winning or losing? Is there a metric we can use to measure this? First, we must identify the enemy. I think everyone can agree we're fighting corruption. If we look at the various false flags of history, discern motive, however malicious, identifying actors and detecting methods, while making as few presumptions as possible, thereby adhering to Occam's razor, we can ascertain just who we are fighting. The corrupting influence infecting America can be traced back to its founding. These factions control America. I'll label Mick, the mob, and the monarchist. The monarchists trace their founding to ancient Greece and are thereby the oldest of the three factions. They use the arguments of Socrates to legitimize their influence. They posit that specialists are best suited to guide a society. Remember, they formed many of their opinions and strategies when they believed that leaders were born, not made. However, today, we know that leadership skills can be taught, and there are also different leadership styles. Being raised an American, as a capitalist, I actually concur with many of the presumptions made by the monarchist. To maximize productivity, I need to reduce duplication of effort, optimize output, and the division of labor accomplishes all these things, right? Additionally, all this encourages specialization. I get it. Capitalism is the validation of everything posited by Socrates was true and accurate. Well, it does if everyone is pulling in the same direction. Everyone is focused on the same goal, that is, making money. However, in a society under a government, people are not usually going to be pulling in one direction. Within communities, we find dissent and diversity. Remember, another strategy of the monarchists is of hoarding resources. Monarchs would hoard as much gold or silver as possible. Why? Of course, the more riches they amassed meant more luxuries afforded them or their subjects. However, by hoarding resources also meant depriving surrounding kingdoms of those same resources. This also explains why the Europeans scoured the planet looking for resources to exploit. They believed in zero-sum game. Zero-sum game is only applicable when what we're measuring is finite. The precious metals of Earth are indeed finite. Earth also lacks an infinite supply of oil. However, global warming or climate change is proof that their zero-sum theory is outdated. Remember, the monarchists came up with this theory 1,000 years ago. Earth will be here long after we're gone. Only a fool would refuse to acknowledge that climate changes, but the accusation that humanity has impacted Earth so catastrophically hasn't been substantiated yet. Besides, there is more gold, platinum, and palladium in our solar system's asteroid belt than there is on Earth. We are now a spacefaring civilization. The whole argument for zero sum is now flawed because our resources are no longer finite. By becoming a spacefaring civilization, we no longer must confine ourselves to Earth and its resources. The monarchists appeared to be defeated with the American and then the French revolutions. However, the 19th century is replete with details that show that the monarchists were still potent and very dangerous. The two opium wars are unambiguous evidence of just how influential they still were. The UK had a trade deficit with China at the time and devised a way to create a demand within China for British goods, namely opium. In other words, the British became drug lords? We today just gloss over this fact, but put in perspective, what they did was despicable. The mob, or organized crime, has been around almost as long as the monarchist. While the warlords of Italy are what we think of today as the birthplace of sophisticated organized crime syndicates, in actuality, the Knights Templar, after having invented the international banking cartel, probably deserve that distinction. Niccolo Machiavelli penned many of his ideas in the 15th century. That's 200 to 400 years after the Knights Templar. Regardless, Machiavelli's influence wasn't confined to the warlords of Italy. It now appears evident that many of the monarchs also heeded his advice. Lastly, the MIC, or the military-industrial complex. It didn't even have a name until the 20th century, although it's evident it was born in the late 19th century. Neither Republicans nor monarchists realized the true contributions of Adam Smith, capitalism, or the spread of industrialization around the globe. Remember, Adam Smith didn't publish his Wealth of Nations until 1776. Sure, both Republicans and monarchists wanted to harness capitalism's great potential, but if we look at the Anti-Federalist platform of 1787, we see that it feared industrialization. The party was led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Is it possible that they distrusted England so much that they feared England would somehow use this export against the American colonies? I surmise that Queen Victoria was a key proponent for weaponizing ideas. I see them, the monarchists, as the proponents for weaponizing everything else, so why not ideas too? Remember, Queen Victoria didn't take power until 1837, and America's last staunch anti-monarchist was probably our 7th president, Andrew Jackson. He was a 70-year-old man when she took power in 1837. With industrialization, the monarchists learned just how profitable war could be. In the 20th century, Americans luckily had men of virtue, like Major General Smedley Butler and former President Dwight Eisenhower, who attempted to warn us, but the indoctrination and propaganda was just too strong and their warnings too isolated. Their warnings went unnoticed by most Americans. I would also like to add JFK's name to those who attempted to warn us, but I know there are many who would quibble whether he was a virtuous man or not. Regardless, let's fast forward to today, because it's evident to most people the machinations which led America to establishing the deep state, which hides its agenda behind a veil of national security. For now, I'll just refer you to Colonel Fletcher Prouty and Michael Lofgren. The deep state could be its own separate video. My second concern is whether President Trump is genuinely anti-establishment or plays one on TV. The American people need to be made aware of the factions. Did you ever see the movie Fistful of Dollars starring Clint Eastwood? The movie's plot is about a man with no name arriving in the town which was controlled by two controlling factions, the Baxters and the Rojo brothers. The man with no name employs the strategy of divide and conquer in order to topple these two regimes, pitting them against one another to weaken them. After the man with no name helps the Rojo brothers destroy the Baxters, he then turns on the Rojo brothers. Well, here's my concern. Just like in the movie, we're being led to believe that the U.S. military is being used to weaken the other two factions, the monarchists and the mob. However, just because we move forward with the indictments, thus resulting in the destruction of the monarchists, who's to say the military will then turn on the mob, or that the military-industrial complex will be made more transparent and accountable to the people? How can I say this? In our country's short history, we have been blessed with an abundance of virtuous men. George Washington, Smedley Butler, and Dwight Eisenhower are all such men. Military men. Even our military needs to be held accountable to the people. How do I know he's not turning on the mob now? Well, while the Gambinos still claim preeminence within the underworld, it's actually the Hebrew mob which reigns supreme today, not the Italians. Jack Ruby, the man who killed Lee Harvey Oswald, the patsy accused of killing our 35th president, John F. Kennedy, he wasn't Italian like we're led to believe. Jack Ruby's real name was Jacob Leon Rubinstein. If you know your history and the establishment of communism, Winston Churchill published an article February 8, 1920 in the Illustrated Sunday Herald of London titled Zionism versus Bolshevism, where he contended that the October Revolution of 1917 was less Russian and predominantly Jewish. Why is this important to mention? Of the 61 original commissars of the Communist Russia, 41 were Jewish. However, the Communists were probably the largest anti-monarchist force of the 20th century. Remember, they killed the Tsar and his family. There is no bringing the monarchy back to Russia. However, Stalin purged many Jews from the leadership of Communist Russia as he fought for dominance. Today, the Russian mafia still has a reputation for being ruthless. However, the boss of bosses is Semyon Mogilevich. He's not Russian mob. He's Hebrew mob. Do you think it's coincidence that Trump is beholden to Israel?
Who was that Israeli academic who threatened that if Europe didn't stand by Israel, abandon Israel, they would nuke European cities?
He was the Israeli professor of military history.
Yeah, that's it. He said it in Amsterdam.
Martin van Creveld. Martin van Creveld.
Yeah.
He said
nuclear weapons and how Israel had threatened European capitals. If you look at the background of this, Israeli military researcher, historian Martin van Creveld had actually threatened European cities with annihilation.
we possess several hundred atomic warheads and can launch them at targets in all directions. All directions. Not the Palestinians, not Hamas, all directions. Perhaps even at Rome.
Remember, the man with no name pitted the factions against one another. Is there any guarantee that those in Washington, D.C. will then make laws forbidding important security jobs from going to persons of dual citizenship? Why do we tolerate the behavior of such a harsh and cruel regime? Do you really believe the Palestinians earn such treatment? The people of the United States have much to answer for regarding what its government does in their name. I advocate making Israel our 51st state. Hell, we pretty much bought them anyway with all the money we've invested in it. However, whether we continue subsidizing the Israeli economy or not should be up to the people of the United States, not some backroom shady deals. Part of President Trump's mandate is restoring transparency to government. Unless the people see movement on any of these promises, you will continue to see skepticism, pessimism, and yes, apathy. Stop with the games and move to remove corruption, restore transparency, and establish laws that can take us well into the future. Remember, the monarchist weapon of choice is our corporations. While societies struggle with identifying and defining corporations' role within society, Queen Victoria increasingly used corporations as a means to collect intelligence, buy influence, and subvert Republican ideas and structures. Here in the U.S., our Constitution reigns supreme. Here's how we can fix our problems. Every impediment to our great republic can be traced to how we define corporations and their relationship to other agencies, institutions, and branches of government. For instance, Congress writes legislation that either exempts them or applies only to them. Insider trading is legal for Congress members. The failure to address this has gone on long enough. I hope you agree.
This is why the politicians go corrupt so rapidly. These guys come into office as members of the middle class, they're just like you, but when they leave, they are multimillionaires. Now, how exactly does that work? How many years on my program have we asked, how did John Conyers make so much money? How did How did Charlie Rangel, who's a middle-class working guy who went and he was a war hero, how has he all of a sudden got houses everywhere as a public servant? It's called insider trading, and in D.C. it is legal.
Hank Paulson, the Treasury Secretary, and Ben Bernanke, who was the Fed chairman. Now, they had a series of briefings and meetings with congressional leaders. These were closed-door briefings to show you how secretive they were. You had to leave your BlackBerry and you had to leave your cell phone at the door because it was that sensitive.
This is when? Right
this
before
is September of 2008.
Before TARP.
That's right, before TARP. Now, the Dow Jones Industrial Average is still over 11,000, so people are a little bit nervous, but panic has not set in yet.
Got it.
And on the night of September the 18th, they hold this briefing at 7 o'clock at night. Members of Congress are there. Let me just give you an example of what happens. At this meeting, according to Paulson's memoir, they describe to the congressman that we are facing financial calamity. They tell them that the stock market's going to go down at least 20%. They explain that we could be facing a worldwide financial crisis and that we need to take action pretty strong and pretty soon. Pretty dramatic statements. According to Paulson, the members of Congress that were there were ashen-faced and stunned at what they were hearing. Well, the next morning, one of those people who was at that meeting is Spencer Baucus. He's a Republican from Alabama, the ranking Republican then, now the chairman of the House Financial Services Committee. He takes that information and the next morning shorts the market. What shorting means is you're betting or knowing that the market's going to go down.
That's crazy that that's allowed to happen.
Yes, and he does it the next day. He buys something called ProShares Ultra Short.
Keep going.
Which is a leveraged options trade. So he literally is betting that that the market is going to go down, and he makes $10,000 off of that one transaction just that one day.
This requires people to say, you know what, this isn't right.
So it turns out exactly a year ago, right now, right this minute, a year ago in Hong Kong, an extraordinary protest began. And the protest was about a law. And the law was proposed by China. The law was to determine how the governor of Hong Kong would be selected. And the law said the ultimate aim was the selection of the chief executive by universal suffrage upon nomination by a broadly representative nominating committee in accordance with democratic procedures. Okay, so the idea was there's a two-step process. The first step was nomination, and then the second step was an election. And the nominating committee would be comprised of about 1,200 people, which means out of 7 million people, that is 0.02% of Hong Kong. All right, now 0.02%, as you can see, is a really tiny number, right? Really, really small. If you thought about it relative to all the people in Hong Kong, it would look something like this. This tiny little corner is 0.02%. So 0.02% get to pick the candidates that the rest of Hong Kong gets to vote among, and the protest was because the fear was this filter would be a biased filter. The claim was that the 0.02% would be dominated by a pro-Beijing business and political elite, so 99.98% would be excluded from this critical first step, with the consequence, obviously, of producing a democracy responsive to China only. Okay, now it turns out the Chinese stole this idea from America. Don't worry, there was no patent or copyright, so there's no IP violations going on here, but they stole the idea from an American, maybe the greatest political philosopher in America, a man named Boss Tweed. Boss Tweed, the head of the Tammany Hall political party, used to say, I don't care who does the electing as long as I get to do the nominating. We take it for granted in the United States that campaigns will be privately funded. But we need to recognize funding is its own contest. Funding is its own primary. We have the voting system where people vote, but in the first stage to that, there is a money primary that determines which candidates are allowed to run in those voting elections. Now, that money primary takes time. Members of Congress and candidates for Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time dialing for dollars. This is an old telephone. You might not recognize this, but dialing for dollars, calling people all across the country to get the money they need to run their campaigns or to get their party back into power. If we could remove the inequality. If we could address that fundamental inequality in this representative democracy, if we could neutralize this tweedism, then we could crack the corruption that makes it impossible for our government to do any of the things we want our government to do. What we need to talk about is a statute that Congress ought to pass tomorrow. Statute, let's call it the Citizen Equality Act. And what the Citizen Equality Act does first is it changed the way campaigns are funded, to make it so that instead of this green primary, we have a money primary, but citizens are funding these campaigns as much as anyone else. The money comes from all of us through proposals like the American Anti-Corruption Act or John Sarbanes' Government by the People Act that would provide small dollar public funding to fund congressional campaigns so that they wouldn't be dependent on this tiny few to fund their campaigns. That's the critical first dimension of equality we ought to insert back into this representative democracy. And there's other inequalities inside of our system. We need equal representation inside of our system. This article, this fantastic article written by Christopher Ingraham for the Washington Post, graphs these gerrymandered districts in the United States. These are congressional districts in the United States. Here's my favorite example of this. You can see the natural community that bonds these people together here. This is a system, they said it's crimes against geography. That's kind of a nice way of putting it. But this is a system where the politicians are picking the voters. The voters aren't picking the politicians, and they pick the voters to create safe seats. Democrats and Republicans both play this game. So in our Congress today, 90 seats are competitive, which means 345 seats are these safe seats, which means if you're a minority party in each of these 345 seats, you don't matter to the representative, because the representative knows he or she doesn't need you, which means 89 million Americans are not represented in this system because we structured this in a way that makes sure that these people don't count. That's inequality. And Fair Vote has a proposal which is incorporated in the Citizen Equality Act to radically change the way we make these districts work so that we have proportional, fair representation across the country. And finally, an equal freedom to vote. The absurd ways in which we make it hard for people to vote, and it's not accidental how we make it hard for people to vote. In the last election, 10 million people had to wait more than 30 minutes to vote, which for people with nannies and iPhones might not seem like a bad thing, but if you're a working family who can't afford that kind of support, that's a poll tax that's too high for too many. As the Brennan Center found in a study that they made of this poll tax is correlated strongly with race. It's racially correlated in the sense that where there are black or brown districts, they're less likely to have the resources necessary to make it possible to vote easily. That, of course, I think is more directly correlated with party, which leads to many proposals incorporated in the Citizen Equality Act, including the Voting Rights Advancement Act that would attack some of these provisions that make it hard for people to vote, and Bernie Sanders' suggestion of Democracy Day, where we move voting to a holiday so working people can vote just as easily as those who don't have to.
Bribery is legal in America. Corporate lobbying needs to be better defined and more precisely regulated.
For the last few years, I've had this sense that everything I learned as a kid about how America's government works is completely wrong. But I had no idea how bad things actually were until I saw this one graph. Researchers at Princeton University looked at more than 20 years worth of data to answer a pretty simple question. Does the government represent the people? Now, this is what they found. This axis here represents public support for any given idea. On the left at 0% are ideas that not a single American wants. On the right at 100% are ideas that everyone supports. This axis represents the likelihood of Congress passing a law that reflects any of these ideas, from a 0 to a 100% chance. On this graph, an ideal republic would look like this. If 50% of the public supports an idea, there's a 50% chance of it becoming law. If 80% of us support something, there's an 80% chance. You get the idea. Now, most Americans would probably agree that, with a few exceptions, we should be as close to this ideal as possible. Unfortunately, the way America actually works doesn't even come close. Take an idea that nobody supports, literally nobody, and it has about a 30% chance of becoming federal law. Now, Take an incredibly popular idea, the most popular idea this country has ever seen, and there's also about a 30% chance of it becoming law. This means that the number of American voters for or against any idea has no impact on the likelihood that Congress will make it law. Put another way, and I'm just going to quote the Princeton study directly here, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy. So if you've ever felt like your opinion doesn't matter and that the government doesn't really care what you think, well, you're right. But there's a catch. This flat line only accounts for the bottom 90% of income earners in America. Economic elites, business interests, people who can afford lobbyists, they get their own line. Look at how much closer their line is to the ideal. When they want something, the government is much more likely to do it. And when they don't, they have the power to completely block it from happening, no matter how much the rest of the country supports it. They get what they want, and guess who ends up paying for it? We pay for it with the most expensive healthcare in the world. We pay for it with a tax code that's a complete mess. We pay for it with internet that's slower and more expensive, with wasteful spending, a floundering education system, a catastrophic drug war, and 1 in 5 American children born into poverty. Almost every major issue we face as a nation can be traced back to this graph. You know, there's this idea out there that this only became a problem after the Supreme Court's Citizens United decision in 2010. But the data goes back almost 40 years, and the results are clear. Corruption is legal in America. And as long as it is, anyone who can spend money to buy political influence will. The solution here isn't rocket science. Make corruption illegal. We already know Congress won't do it. I mean, one look at this chart will tell you that. What we need is a plan that lets us go around Congress and do what the American people do best. Fix this mess ourselves. Well, good news. We have that plan and it's already working. Now that we've got the problem covered, let us show you how to be part of the solution.
We have outsourced our printing of money to a private corporation, the Federal Reserve. Whether this continues should be considered, but it is my opinion that by allowing a private entity this function grants them too much leverage over the government of the United States.
Part of the reason we went into Iraq was the main reason we went into Iraq at the time was we thought he had weapons of mass destruction. It turns out he didn't, but he had the capacity to make weapons of mass destruction. But I also talked about the human suffering in Iraq. And I also talked the need to advance a freedom agenda.
To have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI.
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
The event seems to be something other than what it truly is.
They're playing chess while we're not even playing checkers yet.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
You're now hitting critical mass.
And he says you won the 2004 election.
Because if you listen to most media, a conspiracy theorist or conspiracies are all urban legends.
I think that we have noticed over the years that some of the events that led up to war were not accidental.
My final lead was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike.
Could we have been lied to about everything? Is that even possible?
So the whole thing's a fraud to begin with.
People get caught up in debating if MSNBC has a better perspective than Fox News or ABC, NBC. These are a very narrow window of information.
if you don't toe the line, if you're not official corporate media, it doesn't matter how big your audience is. We're going to control the conversation. If you can be an appropriate mouthpiece for government, if you're not going to challenge the paradigm of statism, we will give you access.
So if you understand who these people are, and you understand what their mission is and how they think and what their ideology is, then most of the mysteries of the modern world, how come we're getting into this mess, or why are we doing this and so forth, they become easy to answer.
And every one of those people knew it was a lie, and they sacrificed the lives of 60,000 American boys.
All human authority is jurisdictional and limited.
The fact is, the superclass exists. That's the problem.
What kind of world government will this be? It might even be worse than war.
Without a massive shift in global consciousness, it's impossible.
If you had a one world government, it would set up the most unrestrained tyranny in history.
The intelligence community needs to be reined in. We need to either abolish the CIA or at least remove them from all operations. Transparency needs to be restored, and the dissolution of perhaps 70 to 80% of the intelligence community wouldn't hinder its effectiveness.
Ecuador for many, many years had been ruled by pro-U.S. dictators, often relatively brutal. They often claimed to be democratic, but they weren't. They were dictators. And then it was decided that they were going to have a truly democratic election. Jaime Roldos ran for office. He was a young, dynamic lawyer, and his main goal, he said, as president, would be to help Ecuador use its resources, particularly its oil, to pull its poor people up by their own bootstraps, to make sure that Ecuador's resources were used to help the people. And he won, overwhelming, by more votes than anybody had ever won anything in Ecuador. And again, first democratically elected president after many years of essentially dictators. And he began to implement these policies to, in fact, do that, to make sure that the oil companies were taxed, or if not, to be nationalized, to make sure that the profits from oil went to help the people. Well, we didn't like that in the United States. I was sent down as one of several economic hitmen, and in that particular job I wasn't the primary one. I was sent in from Panama to help some of the other ones to change Roldos, to corrupt him, to bring him around, to let him know, okay, you can get very rich, you and your family, if you play our game, but if you continue to try to keep these policies you've promised, you're going to go. He wouldn't listen. He knew that his life was in severe danger. I've become good friends with his daughter in recent years. She's now in her 40s and a member of the Congress in Quito in Ecuador. And she said her dad was very aware that he was taking huge risks, but he took them anyway, and he was assassinated.
And the means of assassination was?
His airplane, officially his airplane crashed. He and his wife were on board, and several other men and women, and the defense minister and his wife. And the pilot of that plane, according to Marta Roldos, Jaime's daughter, was a very good family friend, wouldn't have done anything foolish. She says that the official reports, which claim that the weather was very bad and they hit a high mountain, are erroneous. The weather wasn't that bad where they were. By the standards of Ecuador, it was raining. It rains a lot in the coastal plain, and they weren't even in the high mountains. They were coming up in the coastal area, according to Marta. Also, what we do know is that as soon as the plane crashed, the whole area was cordoned off, and nobody was allowed in. Even the local police, the Ecuadorian police, were not allowed in. The only people allowed in were U.S. military from a nearby base, and some of the Ecuadorian military that worked closely with the Ecuadorian military. When an investigation was launched, two of the key witnesses died in car accidents before they had a chance to testify. A lot of very, very strange things that went on around the assassination of Jaime Roldos. I, like most people who've really looked at this case, had absolutely no doubt that it was an assassination. And of course, in my position as an economic hitman, I was always expecting something to happen to Jaime, whether it be a coup or assassination, I wasn't sure, but that he would be taken down because he was not being corrupted. He would not allow himself to be corrupted the way we wanted to corrupt him. Iraq actually is a perfect example of the way the whole system works. So we economic hitmen are the first line of defense. We go in and we try to corrupt the governments and get them to accept these huge loans, which we then use as leverage to basically own them. If we fail, as I failed in Panama with Omar Torrijos and in Ecuador with Jaime Roldos, men who refuse to be corrupted, then the second line of defense is we send in the jackals. And the jackals either overthrow governments or they assassinate the people who won't be corrupted. In the case of both Omar Torrijos and Jaime Roldos, they were assassinated because I failed. And once that happens and a new government comes in, and boy, it's going to toe the line because the new president knows what will happen if he doesn't. In the case of Iraq, both of those things failed. Economic hitmen were not able to get through to Saddam Hussein. We tried very hard. We tried to get him to accept a deal very similar to what the House of Saud had accepted in Saudi Arabia, an amazing deal from our standpoint, but he wouldn't accept it. And so the jackals went in to take him out. They couldn't do it. His security was very good. After all, he had one time worked for the CIA. He'd been hired to assassinate a former president of Iraq and failed, but he knew the system, and he had these look-alike doubles. It's very hard to assassinate a president unless there's people on the inside helping you. And if the people on the inside don't even know whether they're guarding the real guy or a double, it makes it very difficult for them and very, very risky for them. So we couldn't take him out. So in '91, the first President Bush sent in the troops, and we figured at that point, which is the last step. If the economic hitmen fail, the jackals fail, then we send in the military. And of course, all these people always know that the military is standing off in the wings to go in if everything else fails. So in '91, we send in the troops, and we take out the Iraqi military. So we assume at that point that Saddam Hussein is going to come around. We could have taken him out, of course, at that time. But we didn't want to. He's the kind of strong man we like. He controls his people. We thought he could control the Kurds and keep the Iranians in their border and keep pumping oil for us. And then once we took out his military, now he's going to come around. So the economic hitmen go back in the 90s without success. If they had success, he'd still be running the country. We'd be selling him all the fighter jets he wants and everything else he wants. But they couldn't. They didn't have success. The jackals couldn't take him out again. So we sent the military in once again, and this time we did the complete job and took him out, and in the process created for ourselves some very, very lucrative construction deals. Had to reconstruct a country that we'd essentially destroyed, which is a pretty good deal if you own construction companies, big ones. So those are really, Iraq shows the three stages. The economic hitmen failed there, the jackals failed there, and as a final measure, the military goes in.
The U.S. Press Corps, our fourth estate, unfortunately didn't escape corruption, which had also defined corporations' relationship to the news media.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI?
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
The military-industrial complex should be made more transparent, but this should happen last. While I remain skeptical, I do also remain hopeful. Unfortunately, while such changes occur, hopefully they do, it could destabilize our existing infrastructures or perhaps our economy. Whatever the future holds for us, please know that those countries who may wish to see America falter, it would be a mistake to think that America is down for the count. We have proven ourselves time and again our resourcefulness. America wants peace, but make no mistake, we will defend our way of life, prosperity, and to preserve our Constitution. Thank you.